Good morning, everyone. I will start with greeting the President of SARA, Ms. Mzimela, and the Vice President, Senor Matabel. Good morning to all of you. It was raining this morning, as you all know, when we all woke up. And it rained particularly hard where I live because it hasn't rained for a while. So I was reflecting a bit on this presentation, and I am making a presentation. One day I'll grow up. I'll probably, stop making presentations and just speak. The role of rail in not just South Africa, but to talk a little bit more intimately in SADC, in our neighborhoods, in terms of moving our commodities, moving our people, moving manufacturers from the manufactured bases through to export areas. We don't do enough exports of manufactured goods, and that you see reflected on our side in the inefficiencies that we have, and we're pretty upfront and open about this, and the losses that we suffer on the container corridor. But lots of thinking has been going into that. Yesterday I did an interview with a journalist just immediately after the announcement by the Minister of Finance on the capital allocation to us. And one of the questions he was asking me was how much volumes of cargo has moved in Southern Africa between ourselves and rail. And Pumzile kindly gave me, between Pumzile and Bonkosi, I got a number, which was last year, we moved 10 million tons. Now that's not much to be excited about, let's just be honest, okay? We moved 10 million tons. And this year, to date, we've only moved 1.8 million tons. Now that's appalling. And something needs to be done about that. Now, the other number that I raise this, I start like this to you, President and Vice President of SARA, because somehow we need to have, and you would know that I'm a firm supporter of SARA and feel very strongly that it must be properly funded so that you are able to drive these interventions amongst ourselves. If we do not see a substantial increase in this number, it means that our economies are stuck, and that actually the growth that we possibly should be able to drive amongst ourselves is not happening. Now, I know some of you will be saying, what's on road? What I'm going to do, and it's a contribution that we will make from Transnet, is get TNPA to start accurately recording, because fortunately, with TNPA in our stable, we should be able to have accurate data of everything that moved out from South Africa, be it on road or rail, and everything that moved into South Africa that was pushed on road or rail into the region, because then we would have a sense of what's the total volume of trade that we are undertaking. But then we need to ask the next question, how much of it is bi-directional flow? Because that 10 million ton that we did last year, incidentally, was fundamentally chrome, magnetite from South Africa going into the continent. Very little came from SADC into South Africa. So there's very little that we're still trading with each other. And that's, I think it's a challenge that we should all raise for ourselves, because I think you being suppliers into the rail sector on the one side and operators in the sector, surely we should have greater ambition than just being traders. And let's also be brutal on this one. Let's stop being traders of goods manufactured under other people's patents and not our IP, our own IP, because we are still not developing some sort of a base. So I then thought, I don't know, where am I supposed to, it's not working, guys. I'm pressing, oh, okay, finally, thanks. I then thought, I'm going to try and go a lot slower on a thing that we keep on having an unending fight in the media. I'm still not quite sure why, when people are uncomfortable with the model that we're proposing, that people think the easiest way to deal with us is to go and tell a journalist something or whisper something in the hopes that maybe we'll be frightened because the paper tells us so. We won't. You need to come to us and have a convo with us and then say, actually, very interested in this, but here's a problem. I mean, we're quite reasonable people. We'll sit down and we'll talk. So I thought I'd go slowly through this, not necessarily the slide. This is things that we must say. When you look at, and I'm talking in particular just around what is happening around TFR itself. I'm not talking about the rest. The evolution that's been happening in terms of the model. And yes, and it may have taken us time to move from one point to the other point. There may have been moments where we looked like we were moving back, and maybe we did retract. But the intention going forward is to make sure that we actually grow beyond the point that we're at. Now, I prefaced my statement so that you can understand that our posture is not a posture about just little Transnet. We may be big in relative size, but you're small-minded if you only just think about yourself as the logistics and these assets that you have. Our job has got to be, how do we enable our economies to grow and ourselves? So we started with the branch line concessions. Those were not very successful, for a range of reasons. We've listened, we watch, and we looked at what was wrong with that. And I'll come back to some of the changes that we are introducing. Some of the changes that we'll introduce will cause you upset because they look like, yeah, but why don't you do it in this fashion? Because it makes you happy. But people ignore completely that there's an organization that you need to carry along with you to arrive at whatever change that you want to undertake. So over the next couple of slides, just talk through the journey that we're going through. We also have a lot of people who throw PSP, private sector participation, almost as an ideology weapon at us. That's not interesting at all, actually. What is interesting is if you come, because we have been doing partnerships in Transnet, and in fact, if I were to just show you how many partnerships we are doing in Transnet, you'll fall over yourself. Because there's no part of our value chain, or even no part of our companies, we are not in conversation with the private sector in one way or the other. Okay, so maybe we are a lot more inclusive. And so we insist that there should be diversity in the people that we're talking to. We insist on the inclusion. If you're serious and you look at the South African economy, I argue this, is that the lack of growth is because there is no inclusion in the South African economy. It still remains unequal, and it remains for those who always were there. It is crucial that for development, that we really seriously start making sure that as we move forward, we include everybody. Because I've often wondered, whenever people talk about the demography dividend, and you see it and you hear it all the time on the continent, and I often think, but the way we're behaving, demography is a liability. You can't have 68% of your young people unemployed and say that's a dividend. That's a liability. So what is it that we're going to do? And that's why we partner. But when we're partnering, we're asking you rough questions about what are you doing about inclusion? How many young people, black people, are part of your system? And yes, we'll raise the race issue. I mean, sorry, in South Africa, maybe you don't want us to say that. It will be said, because it is time that we said it. And in fact, if you come to the table and you've sorted that stuff out, you have a lovely, warm and lovely hunky-dory relationship with us. But we'll say this because it must be said. Because, guys, we're the adults in the kitchen, if you haven't checked. There are no other adults coming to save us. And the only way that we save ourselves is that we talk a lot more honestly together. So, Senor Matabel, I make the effort of talking my little, in fact, I shouldn't even say talk my little. I don't have any Portuguese in me whatsoever. This project is probably, to my mind, one of the most important projects for not just South Africa and Transnet, and not only just Mozambique, but for the region as well. Because if we can show that we can run a successful borderless train between ourselves, we can run borderless trains between more than just one country. What that entails, and I have to thank you profoundly, Mr. Matabel, for courage, is to have faith that as we set this up, we are able to create an SPV, a structure, where we share equally and with equity between CFM and TFR. If we're able to develop that into a fully fledged operation, as you were saying, who knows? There could be passenger trains on there one of these days. And that is not about revenue, that's about ensuring the inclusion that we're talking about and ensuring that the connection that actually has always existed between our peoples is a connection that's re-established. So for us, really an extremely important project. The failure of that project would not just doom us, yourselves and Transnet, but it would doom actually a lot of initiatives that potentially could arise between all of the countries around us. So really, really very important. So Johnny will be waiting to see if we could create a same structure. What it does require is that us, yourselves and us, as we talk to our various governments, we do need to start seeing changes in how customs is activated at borders, how Home Affairs undertakes their functions. Now, that's not going to happen by our departments of transport or whoever, our shareholders, the Department of Public Enterprises, by thinking that our shareholders will run that debate for us with the policy departments and Parliament. We have to run those debates. For us to be able to run these debates, SARA is absolutely crucial that you have policy making and policy thinking capacity. And that's why we have to support you properly. So really, I mean, the benefits that we're hoping to see on the efficiencies, and for me, what really excites me is what you see on crew productivity going up by 20%. All of our workers work because they want to make an improvement. And if we arrange our lives in a fashion that ensures that their best potential comes to the fore, we would have made life so much better, beyond just at the corporate, at the bottom line level. So that's the first one. Okay, so I'm not even. Then the next area that we are developing, and we've started and we're having long, extensive conversations with logistics service providers in South Africa and some of the shipping lines for that matter. And in any event, anyone here in the room who's interested in raising a hand and saying, I'd like to talk. The thing we don't control as Transnet is cargo, is the volumes. Cargo is owned by the logistics service providers or whoever it might be. So what we've been talking to the shipping lines and the cargo owners and saying, you can buy a whole block train, it's yours, at a wholesale price. You determine the ultimate price that you sell it at. Because by the way, we do know that we undercharge significantly for the services we provide. Is that we then say, it's your train, it's scheduled, but it's almost, in the case of South Africa, and I know TFR and ourselves at the group are constantly having a debate with this, because this is one of those vexed problems. We can provide a reliable rail service. May not be scheduled like the Gau train, but we can provide a reliable rail service. But that presupposes there's no cable theft, which unfortunately in our case is a constant problem that we have to deal with. So what's the opposite? How can you provide? Is diesel. Until such time that there's other fuels that you can use to run trains, you might be able to do differently. What's the problem with diesel? Is that for exporters, and yes, as you know, that export controls for trade barriers are increasing using other mechanisms. One of the things that exporters are expected to show now, and this is a problem for fruit, for agriculture in South African autos and manufacturers, is what's your carbon footprint? The minute we use diesel locos, the advantage that you would have gotten by using rail of a smaller carbon footprint is taken away because that diesel is back. I still think you can make an argument for why it's still better to use diesel on rail than to use diesel on road. But the truth It's a question that needs to be resolved, because if we're able to deal with cable theft or go diesel, you would be able to have a reliable service. But on this corridor, we're absolutely clear, and we've been talking to unions. You know, we are a unionized environment, and we have to talk to our employees to make sure that the decisions we make as a result of strategic interventions we have to undertake or policy do not have a deleterious impact on the workers and their families. So we're talking through this, but it's one of the initiatives that we are undertaking, we're driving hard. The intention is that before the end of this financial year, our financial year ends in March, we should have started running a couple of block trains. Now, this ties up a lot with what we discovered with the branch lines, is that if we couldn't fund the maintenance of a branch line, and even consistently fund the maintenance of our entire system, it was a little bit rich for us to think that when we do a branch line concession, we will get some little small company to invest in the branch line, in the infrastructure, and also run the operations. So one of the things that we are going to do is to make sure that the branch line is maintained at a particular standard, which we'll agree, you and us, but also remember, we are all regulated from a safety perspective by SARA. Then the opportunity here is to get in private sector players. Now, I'll go slow on why slot sales. I hear and I keep on hearing the noise that the 2 years is not sufficient. And I see that a deputy minister also came up on that one. But you've got to have a little bit of faith. The one thing we acknowledge is that unlike Germany or the UK, where you already have a leasing ecosystem, we don't have that in South Africa. So you have to create it fast so that you are able to have people come in, lease rolling stock on whatever. You want it for a year, you want it for 2 years, or whatever that is. The model then becomes viable. Why did we go for a shorter period? Is that because we're still in phase one. We wanted to understand everything that we need to have on our side to drive the policy, this intervention properly. And as Department of Transport is always at great pains to say that slot sales, third-party slot sales is not, as we are running now, their policy, but it's our intervention as Transnet. As soon, and the board has given Transnet Engineering a mandate and approval to go in quickly, find a partner. So we are looking, and that will be public as well. We are looking for a partner to help us set up a leasing company. And we're just looking for cash, because obviously most of the rolling stock that is in South Africa and even on the continent is with us at Transnet. So we will create the leasing company, and that is something that we're fast tracking to enable third parties to lease with us on reasonable terms, 1 year, 2 year, and the rest and the like. That's the one side of it. Also, you'll note in the white paper, and it's clearly indicated, that there are 2 dimensions that the Department of Transport still have to sort out, and I imagine that they sort that out with the Department of Trade and Industry, is the localization requirements that are going to be attached to the policy. So in this case, the last area is that with the branch lines, you were not able to run a branch line right through to the end destination, a branch line service. Now you're going to be able to run the branch line service through to the end destination. So you take away double handling costs and the rest and the like. So completely different. And as we say, we arrived at this point not just out of our own analysis of the situation, but because there are people who chose to come and sit down and talk to us and tell us their constraints and give us ideas, that we were able to arrive at this point. Now, the back of ports are absolutely crucial. Durban, the plan is to have that port expand from the current 2.9 million TEUs to 11 million TEUs, not in 40 years. I had edited that out. In less than 40 years. The plan is to front load that investment quite fast. Between the next 12 to 15 years, we should be at 11 million TEUs. By that time, you need to have as much capacity at the port, if not quite 11 million tons, because we understand that flows to the port will be both on road and on rail. But rail, I think, sees an increases to 8 million tons or so for evacuation out of Durban. So quite a significant investment that has to happen, one. Number two, we then also need to develop back of ports. So we're working very closely with Dubai Trade Port. Years ago, there had been an idea to build a railway line from there to the port. As long as we were never going to move cargo from the port to there, to Dubai Trade Port, it didn't make any economic sense. Now that we're working jointly together, because here's the truth, no SEZ is functional if it doesn't have a rational relationship and a symbiotic relationship with the nearest port around it. So we're working closely with them. Cato Ridge is always going to be interesting, but it's one area that we're looking at for decongesting. We are working with the old, the old Durban airport is one area of it. In the meantime, immediately we're working on creating an auto supply park with Toyota. But we've got that extensive land that we can then make available also for the back of port. If you go to Richards Bay, Nsezi, Mandlanzini is an area that we think we could have quite a useful back of port. Now, note, the areas that we are increasingly going to, Mandlanzini, Nsezi, is in a rural community, is in a community where we would be able to be generating jobs right next to people. And that's an area where we would be looking for private sector participation and co-investment with ourselves. And wherever we have sidings, we are bringing those to the table. On rolling stock, the project that we started off with, there are some of our customers who own their own wagons already. But what we were trying to do, which seems to have missed the point somewhat, but we are working on the conversation with that one, is to also sell some of the wagons that we own on the iron ore line, for example, because that's a closed system. It's only those customers. In part, we're selling some of this rolling stock because we're looking to get cash into Transnet, and that's the truth. But also, in part, is to ensure that as we develop this multifaceted business model where we have hook and haul services, block trains, and the rest and the like, it becomes a reality. Apropos the point, you can't say you're changing your business model and you don't create the possibility for the model to function by letting people own bits and bobs of your system. On the properties, on sidings, increasingly our partnerships on the sidings are you going to bring us volumes that will bring that capacity onto rail? If you are, we will sit down, have a conversation, and actually we are also looking at longer term contracts. Hopefully we will end up with some sort of sensible deal on the Tsanin facility terminal, inland terminal. And there in Tsanin, we've been very clear with the partners who have approached us that we would want to make sure that the emerging black farmers in that area, both for citrus and any other commodity that comes from that area, is a direct beneficiary of those facilities, including the cold chain facilities that are necessary as well. I'm towards the end, don't worry. So on the slot sales, there is the policy that's being developed. We understand that with the white paper, what you end up with is, and this is our position so that we're also quite clear, is that TFR ends up as having the infrastructure owner who owns the entire network. There would be pieces that we might concession, and that we would concession on the back of does it make sense or doesn't it make sense as a business case. And we look at the NPV and the impact it has on Transnet and the impact it has on the system. In those cases, we may do a concession where we say, you look after the infra, but we continue to make sure that you're maintaining it at the standard that we've set. We had a really interesting meeting with the Kenyan government, Kenya Railways, a few months, probably a year ago. And when we had the meeting, the then President, President Kenyatta, sent a message to the CEO, and he said, can the CEO please tell us, because they had done a concession, where they concessioned out the rail. And they said, tell the South Africans to come listen to us and learn from us and not to repeat what we did in Kenya. So we've taken some of the lessons that the Kenyans had in terms of making sure that whatever we do, we ensure that the system remains sustainable and we continue to invest. Now let's also be honest. I mean, it's not like in terms of our custodial role as TFR and Transnet, we've always been very good in terms of looking after the track. What we have made as a commitment as Transnet is that to the extent that our license to operate we get from the safety regulator and ensuring that the system is maintained at the appropriate level, that we will fulfill. The only thing we can't do on our own as Transnet, and really we're very grateful to the mining industry and all the other customers who have come to the table to help us on security, is securing the network. 30,000 kilometers that covers the whole country is not a thing that you can secure if you're not a police force on your own. And that's not what we are. So just lastly, and this is such a busy slide, so the intention is really not to confuse you, but really rather to say on the policy side, there's a lot. We're working with the Department of Transport and Public Enterprises with regards to the basic regulatory model that they will use for the interim, that in fact the interim economic regulator translates to ultimately on the other side when economic regulation happens. That's the one side. The other, we've already started with a team working from Transnet, working with the Department of Transport on ensuring that there's proper planning for infrastructure maintenance and extensions wherever necessary, because as you recall, the rail white paper, the rail policy indicates that government will finally fund infrastructure. I have been thanking KfW everywhere, where the German Development Bank, everywhere where I go, because we had a meeting. I had a meeting with them, I think a month after I started at Transnet, the most eye-opening meeting of my life. And they explained to me how the German government funds infrastructure on that side. It's been the best thing ever, because ever since that meeting, have then made sure that we go and talk to government at every single point. As I keep on repeating, and I'll repeat it until the day the government starts funding infrastructure, is the German government between 2020 and the year 2029 is going to be giving and has been given Deutsche Bahn, which actually is a national company with private sector ownership of one sort or the other, as well as the regional government, but is fundamentally state-owned. 63 billion euros. Got to digest that number. 63 billion euros comes directly from the fiscus in Germany to support infrastructure, maintenance, upgrades, and sometimes expansions. And in the German system, that's not called a, what's the word that they call it when government gives state-owned enterprises money? It's not called a bailout because they're Germans. So we'll see when government starts to put in infrastructure in South Africa, what it will be called. Most importantly, and as I keep on arguing and saying, if your intention is to drive exports and to ensure that logistics is affordable, you have to undertake that investment as the government. So that conversation has started both with the Department of Transport and the National Treasury, and putting in the numbers that are required so that we would be able to price the service at a level that makes sense. Because in the absence of that, the one area of work that we're working hard at Transnet, and I imagine again people will be wanting to murder us next year, is repricing the system. Because we're saying we have to go to full cost recovery, if we're going to be able to create a sustainable Transnet on the other side that continues to provide services on an ongoing basis. So I tried to not be my usual fast self, and I hope it was fewer slides, and I hope my tone came off as one of, we really are not that horrible. We're really nice. If you take us on, we take you on. But when you're not taking us on, and you really want to work, and for me, you as Sarah have to be regarded as part of the family. There may be things we do in the way that we procure that causes you nightmares. And maybe, Caesar, at some other session, we might do a presentation on the changes that we have made on procurement, which would ensure that we are finally able to have long-term relationships that work for you as suppliers. So increasingly, lots of 7-year master service agreements, lots of 7-year contracts with customers, so that you are able to also invest appropriately, and that we then are able, and also, believe it or not, have put in clauses into our 7-year procurement contracts that we can renew with you on condition that you innovate, your pricing is competitive going forward. So it really intentionally, I mean, our intention is to have a dynamic, robust relationship between yourselves and the yourselves and ourselves as part of the supply chain. We'll soon announce the partnership that we've entered into with NARCAM. And I don't know, some of you may know NARCAM. NARCAM is the components guys who do the it's the association body of all of the components manufacturers in the auto sector. Now, why we specifically wanted to partner with NARCAM and are pleased with NARCAM as a partner is that NARCAM will help you expand, create network opportunities in the supply base where you can supply to autos and springboard to supplying directly to ourselves. But really, I wish you the best over the next few days. And really, I'm hoping that all of the funders in the room, including ourselves as Transnet, really open their pockets, and we make sure that SARA is properly funded, and that we then give it a proper policy mandate so that we can ensure that there's consistency in policy between ourselves as regional bodies. But thank you very much again.